we're going through the COVID inquiry at the moment. I think it's fair to say that so far the reputation of Boris Johnson's government, and particularly Number 10, is being absolutely shredded in that inquiry. A macho, bullying, slipshod, incompetent environment which was veering all over the place and really behaving pretty badly indeed. As somebody who was there at the time, is there a case for the defence?
So my, obviously, role began a little later when we got close to having a vaccine, and therefore I was brought in to be Vaccine Deployment Minister. And I have to say, the information, the revelations over the past 24, 48 hours are a surprise to me. What I think needs to happen...
Do you feel embarrassed about them?
Of course, there's no doubt. I cannot...
I mean, you fought for these guys. You campaigned for them, and you helped get them into power. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it is a pretty ghastly picture that's being painted.
It is worrying. Now, the one caveat I would place on this, and I hope you'll agree with me on this, is that the reason for the inquiry is for it to hear all the evidence.
And there is more to come.
Pretty unsavoury stuff that we've been hearing over the past 24, 48 hours, and then to be able to report and conclude as to the balance of evidence, how the government performed. Now, I will give evidence next year on the vaccine and how we deployed the vaccine. I have to say to you, nobody in my team, and the brilliant Emily Lawson and Brigadier Phil Prosser and Nikki Kanani and Ruth Todd and many others who were part of that team, you will see, I hope, that we worked as a team, professionally and with respect, and delivered against that, which I hope will maybe be a counterbalance to some of the stuff we're hearing in the early days of the pandemic.
And Boris Johnson will no doubt be watching from somewhere, sort of steaming and with steam coming out of his ears. Do you think that people like Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain are reliable witnesses against him?
Everybody is under oath, and I think the inquiry should be allowed to hear all the evidence, to go wherever it needs to go to. And I would say, before we jump to any conclusions, we ought to, read the conclusion of the inquiry, read what the inquiry will deliver at the end of the day.
So we were just talking there about the COVID inquiry. The third day this week of its evidence was dominated by Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, who said she could not recall a single day when the COVID rules were followed in Number 10. As for those parties, she said we collectively got all of that really, really wrong. She said there was a toxic and macho atmosphere under Boris Johnson, a de facto assumption that we were going to be great without any of the hesitancy or questioning that usually happens in government. The female perspective was often missing. Well, to talk about all of that, I'm joined now by Amy Gandon, a former senior policy advisor in the Cabinet Office, now head of policy at the Royal Society of Arts. Amy, very good to see you there. First, general question. Dominic Cummings gave evidence yesterday and painted a picture of ministers really being under the thumb of civil servants and nobody being in charge. As somebody who was there at the time, what was your impression?
Well, I think, first of all, I have to say that I think that's just not true. I think that he speaks in very general and sweeping terms about the Cabinet Office. And in the first instance, I would say that it's very important to be very specific about the Cabinet Office, which is an incredibly large multi-component organisation. I think what he's actually referring to, though I don't want to put words in his mouth, is a small subset of the Cabinet Office, which is probably the secretariats that supported Cabinet and also the Civil Contingency Secretariat, which sort of supports government in emergencies. So the first thing to say is that those parts of government are not about, they don't have policy ownership. They collectively facilitate discussion and decisions by ministers.
To put it plainly, you do what you're told.
Well, yes, and I suppose the whole point of the Cabinet Office is to facilitate ministerial steers and decisions. I think there's possibly a risk that where those ministerial relationships aren't working, that therefore the tail, I suppose, the structures and processes that those civil servants put in place wags the dog, i.e. the kind of content and outcomes of political decision-making.
Now, you've done a big piece of research. I think you've interviewed 50 current and former civil servants. And that has given you a few sort of pointers to what's going on, one of which is that relations are breaking down between civil servants and politicians. Why do you think that is?
I think so. Yes, you're right. So I've done a report together with Reform Think Tank, which, as you say, interviews particularly mid-level civil servants, which is quite an unprecedented glimpse into government. 47% organically raised that relationships were more difficult with ministers. I think a lot of people said that there were sort of foregone conclusions. Lots of ministers were coming in sort of inherently hostile to civil servants, suspicious of them.
Yeah.
And that has big impacts.
Was there a kind of
Trumpian
Trumpian view of the blob or the swamp, do you think, spreading through the party?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that has actually really come from listening to civil servants and showcasing their voices, which doesn't often happen because of restrictions on them sharing publicly about their work. But actually, the research shows that civil servants are actually, quite opposite to the blob. They're actually very hungry for reform, and they share lots of the criticisms and frustrations of government that people like Mr. Cummings have.
Very interesting. Helen McNamara today was very much focusing, or maybe she was just asked about, the sort of misogyny inside government, this kind of atmosphere in which women were talked over, there's mansplaining and all of that. Women were not in some of the crucial meetings. And when it came to COVID, of course, the female perspective on what to do was really, really important. So again, you were there at the time. What was your impression?
Well, I won't be drawn on my kind of personal experiences. I'm still bound by the Civil Service Code, but my research participants did have concerns about the diversity of teams, and in particular the way that promotions were made very quickly during that time. And in fact, that therefore might have compromised the diversity of perspectives and experience on COVID policy, which is worrying. The final thing I would also say that in terms of the negative language that Mr. Cummings himself used, but that was referenced as well, I think Mr. Cummings himself has said that that's trivial and that we should really be thinking about the content of decision making. And I agree with him on that. But I also think that negative language does have a material impact on the openness and comfort with which advisors in civil service can actually do their jobs.
Language can be a form of sort of intimidation, and almost violent intimidation, stopping people speaking out.
Yes, and that we see in the research that there's actually quite a lot of evidence of the distortions to advice being given, withdrawal of information, massaging of risks to be perceived more positively as a result of that kind of more intimidating culture. So it is actually of material concern.